Hello and welcome to the stream about Jason Hehir's documentary, The Last Dance, which, as I've said in the description prior to this and in some of my comments about it, I don't think is just one of the best sports documentaries I've ever seen, but it's just one of the best documentaries in the modern era. The techniques that it uses have been replicated by other documentaries since that time, and be it things, I don't know that he was necessarily the first person to use the idea of handing an iPad to someone he was interviewing and then getting someone to react and watching that reaction. And we see different variations of this, as well as the moving back and forth. So he's not having to tell the story completely chronologically. We're able to move back and forth in time. So we're constantly kept refreshed and not having to bear the burden of carrying the story from Jordan being born until this time. We're able to move back and forth and involve different characters. And so any documentary works like any good story. You're able to involve the audience, you're able to keep them engaged over a long period of time. And 10 episodes is a long period of time. And I didn't watch this when it first came out. I came to it I'm going to say some years later, maybe a couple years later, when it had gotten a reputation already, and just binged right through it. I think whenever you find anything that is really well done, you're engaged and you want to keep going with it. So, what are the different storylines in The Last Dance that kept me involved? Well, I would say the first is the time period. So, I think Michael Jordan was still playing. Not think he was definitely still playing in the NBA when me and my family moved to the United States. We moved in the end of the 1980s. We moved to Dallas. The team that was in Dallas, still in Dallas to this day, the Mavericks, were not very good at that time. And I was getting used to all of these American sports that I hadn't really seen growing up in Singapore. And I went. I'm pretty sure I went to at least one Mavericks game, but I would watch the games on TV, started to understand basketball. But Michael Jordan as a person who transcended basketball. So even if you weren't following basketball, everybody knew who Michael Jordan was. There were the shoes, there was the advertising, Gatorade, all of that. And so he was already a cultural icon. Now, when I say that realizing now that that was not at all taken for granted. There is a model for this in someone we talked about in a previous stream, which is OJ Simpson, where someone transitioned from sports and then became a cultural icon. For OJ, that wasn't long lived. For Michael Jordan, it's been much longer. He's been able to hold on to that cultural icon status and transition to other things. He owns, for example, a NASCAR team, he owns an NBA team, he has other business interests, and I think he maybe even owns part of an alcohol company. But the point is, he is one of the, I would say, pioneers in transitioning from I'm not just a specialist in something, whether that's I'm not just a singer or I'm not just an actor, I'm not just a basketball player, I'm not just a football player. I'm able to do all of these different things. So I think at the very center of the documentary, of course, is Michael Jordan and reflecting on who he is and the moment. And we see some of this in the sort of rise of Caitlin Clark in the United States and WNBA, of people who were not previously interested in a sport or in a league, but the player catches their imagination and then they do go. And so not having, I think, been culturally aware enough, I would have been a very early teenager to have been culturally aware enough of the impact of Michael Jordan. I wasn't into basketball enough that I would have hung his posters, and my family didn't have enough money to buy me his shoes. Although some of my classmates, they did, wear his shoes, and I thought that was the coolest thing. What's behind Michael? Great coaching. So I think that you have to understand that one athlete on his own can compete well in an individual sport. So let's say swimming, running, long jump, high jump, any kind of skiing, let's say downhill skiing. But the minute that you start to become part of a team, it's not enough for you to be a spectacular player. You also have to be surrounded by at least good players And you have okay. I think we're back. Sorry for that. I don't know how long the stream went out for. I don't think I'll be able to really recapture it. So I'm going to try to squeeze back to when I saw the pinwheeling start to happen. And if you can't hear me in the chat or you see having any other difficulties, please let me know. So the last thing that I said before I started to lose some audio and video was the idea of the difference between an individual sport and a team sport. So in an individual sport, you don't necessarily have to be worried about who's around you or even necessarily your coach. Those do matter. But when you're playing in basketball and you have four other players and a coach, that really matters. And I think the documentary does an excellent job of noting that Michael was surrounded by at least very good players, if not in some cases, exceptional players. And we saw the difference in how Michael was able to perform when he had okay coaches and when he had generational coaches, someone like Phil Jackson with, I don't know, what does he have, a dozen rings? I've read, it's funny, I've read his book, and the title of his book is the number of rings he has, which includes rings he has as a player that he won as a player. But Phil Jackson and the entire documentary's name is from the title that Jackson, whenever he would start a season with his guys, he would give them some theme. He would distribute a notebook and he would talk about different things that he wanted to achieve in that season. And that season, when everyone was put on notice that Jerry Krause said this team is going to get broken up and Phil Jackson will not continue to coach, he said, okay, well, this is the last dance. So how are we going to go about this? And so he set the tone for that season. And then obviously that then sets the tone for the documentary. And now it's entered the lexicon such that people refer to, I would like this person to, shoot my last dance or whatever else it might be, that people now understand what that means culturally. And I think part of it is the fact that the director and the team did such an amazing job. So Phil Jackson. So here are the pieces we have. We have Michael, we have Phil Jackson, we have someone like Scottie Pippen. So when I first read it, I got a little curious, read a little bit. Scottie Pippen was apparently quite upset about how he was portrayed in the documentary. I didn't think he was unfairly portrayed, so I thought, okay, I'll read Scottie Pippen's autobiography, which was called Unguarded. I read it. It was mediocre at best. Uh, And it's unfortunate that someone so talented who's made it in life in many ways still holds on to this sort of weird bitterness. And in a sense, the fact that Scotty felt he had to write that book and wrote it in such a manner underscores that it wasn't him, it was Jordan. But as Jordan says in the documentary, when people say Michael Jordan, they should say Scottie Pippen because Scotty was such an integral part of that team and the way that the Bulls were able to move forward. You also have Dennis Rodman. Rodman is his own story, but the idea of Phil Jackson recognizing a sort of tortured artist in Dennis and using management techniques to get the most out of him, to say, all right, this person, is it fair to use the word unbalanced? I think we could say that. He's unbalanced in some ways. And so we have to give him room to exist and play and be a different person. And I appreciate that. Michael Jordan's very much the work ethic guy. The line he gives from the documentary is, I never asked my teammates to do something that I wasn't willing to do. And so he goes to Las Vegas, pulls Rodman out of his drug and liquor enforced stupor and brings him back and says, you're going to have to practice and we're going to run extra hard today so you can get that hangover done. You also have rivalries with other players and other teams, the Pistons, who had their sort of thugs and thug way of playing basketball, and some of the older school people would say that that's the more pure form of basketball. That's a different conversation. But the whole rivalry with Isaiah Thomas, I feel like that was good to hear aired because I think you hear both sides, whether you want to agree with Isaiah or you want to agree with MJ. There's also this really poignant thing about Michael and his family. And, I was so impressed. His mother refers to her father, and I've heard this in very formal situations in other countries and in other cultures, in which the mother, when speaking to an outsider, will refer to her husband as Mr. So and so. So she is saying to the interviewer that one thing that Mr. Jordan and I wanted to, you know, give to Michael early on. And I thought, wow, that is really from a different era. And Mr. Jordan and Michael had such a close relationship. And the really unfortunate, spoiler alert, the murder of Mr. Jordan, which seemingly is unrelated to Michael or his fame or status. It seemed to be a very strange and random event that happened. And the emotion that came pouring out when Michael won that, I think, tournament, that final, on or around Father's Day. And it really hit him that this was the first Father's Day he was going to be without his dad, and it really meant something to him. So, what does it mean when you have an intact family with good values raising somebody with great talent? You can do great things. And interestingly enough, we have another basketball player coming up who self claims to be the greatest of all time, who shall remain unnamed. But everyone knows, if you have to claim to be the greatest, you're not the greatest. If you are the greatest, other people know that about you. But what that cries out, what that screams, is this great insecurity, and underlines the fact it doesn't matter how successful you are, it doesn't matter how many NBA finals you've won. If you're so insecure that you have to give press conferences in which you claim, yes, I know I am the greatest, it indicates that you're not the greatest. If you were, you wouldn't need to say so. The people who are don't need to say that they are. Now, it can be said that Michael was, I think the story given out is he was doing his own PR push for claiming this title. But I watched some interviews of the director, and his first meeting with Michael, he said, "Why do you want to do this?" And Michael said, "I don't." And some of the notes were um, to that when the project started, they said it was just going to be a 2016 season. You're not going to sit down with Michael. There's not going to be any interviews. We're going to control what music you have. We're going to control what clips you take. And when you look at the stakeholders involved and what it took, so it took a year and a half to come up with episode one, because they would get back 20 pages of single spaced comments on what they'd seen, which was extraordinary. And then by the time that they had established trust in a system and they were flowing, I found it only took them 12 days to do episode 10. So, hold on, Michael is making a point here. Did Ali say that? Seems like he did. Yeah, I think he did. Um, First of all, Muhammad Ali is a sort of species of one, right? He's quite an individual. And I don't know boxing well enough to know whether he was the greatest of all time as a boxer. He was certainly like Mike Michael is a cultural icon for many reasons. I mean, one of my favorite lines of his is "No Viet Cong ever called me N word," right? And that whole refusing to go to enter the draft. And so I still maintain that if you have to claim that you are the greatest, that you're not. And as I say that, I think I can hear him saying, like, oh, I'm the greatest of all time. Um, and maybe that is an indictment. Maybe he isn't the greatest of all time. But as I say, I don't know enough about boxing. And I say that maybe, and I can't really say I know enough about basketball. But I think I still maintain the idea that greatness isn't in your opinion of yourself. It is in the opinion of those around you who you formed, who depended upon you, who you've raised up, who you've given encouragement to, who think about you, who remember you. And that's how greatness is defined. Greatness isn't defined by your own opinion of yourself. Because if it were so, then I'm sure that a lot of us would think that about ourselves. But circling back to my last point before that was this intact family structure, and that's something that we've moved so far past, that at the end of the 80s, early 90s, there was not as much family destruction as we have now. And we have we have we have an epidemic of broken families, of divorce, of single motherhood, so called. And the effects of society on society are catastrophic. I think we see that all around us, and people understand families are the building blocks of society. And if a family is not protected, then society will implode. Those are directly related. So if you tell people families are not important, families are whatever we want it to be, you can identify as whomever you are for whatever reasons. Men can be pregnant. You The list goes on and on. Society explodes, implodes, however you want to look at it. And in this time, the Jordan family raising Michael, I think, still represented a norm. It was still normal to have two parents. And I don't think even I growing up in the 80s and 90s, I I didn't really know much of any divorce in the circles that my family was in. Divorce wasn't even something that could exist as an idea. Not only because it was forbidden by church law, and our family, we were observant Catholics, but the idea that you would just give up on your family didn't make any sense to me, because I'd seen my parents work through challenging circumstances. And I think that's what's interesting. People always say, oh, well, you don't want to fight in front of the kids. And the idea being, oh, you want to give the kids the impression that marriage has no problems. My parents worked through their challenges. They had arguments, and we as kids heard them. But I think what that did was it underlined for us that marriage has challenges, and you work through those challenges. Those two things went together. In marriage, you have challenges, you work through those challenges. You don't give up on each other, you don't give up on your family, you don't give up on your children. And so that dedication to of Mr. Jordan to Michael all the way till his death was very touching. And I really felt drawn into that. And that's what I'm talking about. All these different storylines woven together expertly by the team, by the director, by all of these people authentically looking back at something that happened 20 years ago, and they've had time for their emotions to cool down. Some people, they still had some hot emotions about things. It was interesting. And being able to look back and say, wow, what that meant. And that reminds me too, Steve Kerr's interview about his father, Malcolm Kerr, being killed at the American University of Beirut, um, during the time when things were hotting up in Lebanon. And all of these different stories together from all these different people just made it such a rich experience, and something that I really appreciated and enjoyed. What else do we have here? Good evening. Good evening, Didymus. No Chinese ever called me goyim. Yeah, probably not. Um, that goes together, with the classic idea of there's no Chinese crime epidemic in the United States because they're too busy. They're too busy doing tutoring and working to get into crime. It's not allowed. Chinese mother wouldn't allow crime because it goes against productivity or working on the family business or whatever else it might be. So I think the last thing I want to address before I wrap up, because I am hosting another live stream today. Shameless plug for Palestine Bookshelf. We're going to be talking about 1948 creation and catastrophe, and the people who are behind the documentary might be joining me. Pretty sure. I don't want to say for sure because technical things could always get in the way, just like they did for a bit of our live stream today. But um, that'll be happening in just about 10 minutes time. So feel free to when this stream ends, hop over there if you're interested in talking about that film. But just to wrap up and to talk about this, the human condition as represented to us by documentaries, especially well done ones like these, like this one, gives us an opportunity to reflect on what people dedicate their lives to and whether that's relevant, whether that's important. Now, in the natural order, in the natural order, Michael Jordan has achieved a lot. He lifted up a town, an entire city of people. And beyond that city of people, people all around the world. We saw the video of him going to Asia or Europe and other places where people were just entranced with him. He was able to activate something in them. So he had an impact not just in the city of Chicago, not just in the United States, but worldwide, not just for basketball, but for other things. And that idea of being like Mike was a wholesome brand. And that sometimes when that wholesome brand touched onto things that were slightly negative, that he liked to gamble, people really came out at him for it. And you can see that fatigue in the documentary that being famous is a burden. Everyone thinks, oh, wouldn't it be nice? And everybody who is famous, who's been willing to be transparent and honest about it, and is not a narcissist, has told you that fame is a burden. And you can see it in his face and the way that he is represented in some of these old films. And you can see he's like, he can't go out of the hotel room, or he's even the subject of a poisoning attack from the Utah Jazz. And I think Karl Malone refused to be interviewed for this documentary. So if you haven't seen it, I hope that I've convinced you to at least take a look at episode 1. You don't have to be interested in basketball. You don't really have to know much about Michael Jordan. And I think episode 1 will pull you into the story from every aspect, and then you can take it from there. But I do think it's binge worthy. I do think it's a good look at what is it that we dedicate our lives to. Is that worthy? And what else is there? Right. So if you've achieved what you wanted to achieve in the natural order, is that all there is? Is this life all there is, or is there something more than this life? And if you've achieved that much, you've at least bought yourself the time to look into those greater questions. So take one last look here at the thanks for the stream. Well, you're welcome. If there are any questions or other comments, I will take them. Otherwise, we'll wrap up and I'll head over to the stream. Again, apologies for the strange internet lapse. It just seemed to go black for a little while earlier on in the stream. So thanks for your patience with that if you lost the stream for a little bit. All right. I think that's it. Thanks everybody for joining me. If you're interested in joining me for a stream in 5 minutes, head over to Palestine Bookshelf. There you're going to see my discussion of 1948 creation and catastrophe. And hopefully we'll see you on the next live stream here.